It was supposed to be just another legendary night in Las Vegas. On March 21st, 1987, the showroom at Bally's casino was packed with over 5,000 fans. The lights dimmed, the crowd roared, and then, there he was, Dean Martin, the king of cool himself, stepping onto the stage in a black tuxedo, flashing that effortless charm that made him a household name. His voice, though raspier than in his prime, still had that velvet touch. As the opening chords of Everybody Loves Somebody filled the room, couples leaned into each other, swaying to the music, soaking in the nostalgia. But just as the verse began, Dean froze. He turned his head sharply toward the wings. His smile dropped. His face went ghost white. Without a word, he placed the microphone down on the piano and calmly walked off stage. No announcement, no explanation, just silence. The band, caught off guard, played a few more bars before fading out. The audience clapped, thinking it was part of the act. But backstage, something unimaginable had just happened. Dean Martin was about to receive a phone call that would shatter his world completely. Within moments, the performer everyone thought was untouchable, the man who never flinched, never cracked, would break in a way no one had ever seen before. And what followed in the next 48 hours would reveal a side of Dean Martin that fame had never touched, a father consumed by grief, unraveling in real time. But before we get to that moment, we need to understand who he lost, and why that loss broke him forever. To truly grasp the weight of Dean Martin's heartbreak, you need to understand who his son really was. Because Dean Paul Martin wasn't just the child of a famous crooner. He was the embodiment of everything his father admired, and everything he secretly wished he could be. Nicknamed Dino as a boy, Dean Paul was born into Hollywood royalty, the son of one of the most iconic entertainers of all time. That kind of legacy usually crushes kids. But Dino didn't fold under the pressure. He soared above it. By the time he was a teenager, Dean Paul had already made a name for himself in ways that had nothing to do with his father's fame. He was a junior tennis champion with a fierce competitive streak, going toe-to-toe with the best on the court. At just 13, he co-founded a pop rock band with Desi Arnaz Jr. and Billy Hinch. Their group, Dino, Desi, and Billy, landed record deals, toured, and even performed on national television. Most celebrity kids were getting into trouble. Dino was getting applause, and that was just the beginning. As he got older, Dino turned to acting, taking on film and television roles with a quiet intensity that surprised critics. But his greatest passion? Flying. He trained with the Air Force, earned his wings, and became a captain in the California Air National Guard, piloting F-4 Phantom jets. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to serve. Because he wanted to prove he was more than a last name. Dean Martin was always the image of control, of calm charisma. But when people talked about Dino, they said you could see a different side of Dean, the proud dad who couldn't help but brag. And it wasn't about fame. It wasn't about success. It was about who Dino was: kind, humble, driven. The kind of man any father would be proud of. But for Dean Martin, he wasn't just proud. He was emotionally tethered to his son. Dino wasn't only a part of his life. He was his life. And that made what happened next unbearable. Dean Martin wasn't known for being vulnerable. On stage, on screen, in interviews, he was the same smooth-talking, unshakable icon the world adored. The drink in his hand, the wink in his eye, the effortless one-liners. He was untouchable, or at least that's how he wanted to appear. But there was one person who cracked through that armor: Dean Paul. To the world, Dean was the embodiment of cool. But to his family, especially to Dino, he was just dad. And not the distant, hard-to-reach type that fame often produces. Dean and Dino were close. Unusually close. Their connection wasn't built on glitz or privilege. It was built on shared laughs, phone calls, late-night conversations, and genuine admiration that went both ways. They were best friends. Dean once told a friend that Dino was the only person who could make him nervous because he cared that much about what his son thought of him. Those around Dean saw it clearly. Dino wasn't just a favorite child. He was his father's entire emotional anchor. And it wasn't a quiet favoritism either. Friends, family, even other Rat Pack members knew it. Frank Sinatra once joked, "You don't talk badly about Dino around Dean, unless you want to see him turn cold." Dino represented something bigger than just love. He represented legacy. Not the fame, not the money, but the human legacy, who Dean Martin was behind the curtain. When Dino became a pilot, it terrified Dean, but he never let it show. He respected his son's choices, even if they scared him. He admired Dino's courage, his discipline, his drive to live a meaningful life on his own terms. That admiration ran deep. It made Dean feel, and that was something he didn't do easily, especially in public. But that bond, that powerful connection between a father and his son, it would soon become the very thing that unraveled Dean Martin completely. By early 1987, Dean Martin was slowing down. The years of smoking had carved a rasp into his once silky voice, and the constant travel, the constant spotlight, had worn him thin. He wasn't the unstoppable Rat Pack showman anymore. He was a 69-year-old father trying to hold on to the last pieces of his old life. Still, he performed here and there, mostly in Las Vegas, where the crowds didn't just come for the music, they came for the memory of who he had been. But on the morning of March 21st, something rare happened. Dean woke up in an unusually light mood. He joked with the crew, arrived early to the casino, even asked about people's families. No one understood why he seemed so relieved, so peaceful. But Dean knew. He had spoken to his son that morning. The call came from March Air Force Base in California. Just a casual check-in, the kind they'd had 100 times before. Dino told him he was prepping for a routine training flight later that day. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous enough to worry his father. Before hanging up, Dino said the words Dean never got tired of hearing. "I love you, Dad." And Dean said what he always said back, even if he didn't say it easily. "I'm proud of you, son." It was simple, ordinary, the kind of conversation you barely remember, until suddenly, it's the last one. Dean had no idea he was speaking to his son for the final time. No idea that just hours later, that warm, familiar voice would vanish from the world forever. No idea that the memory of that call would replay in his mind like a broken record for the rest of his life. And as he walked on stage that night, tuxedo pressed, smile fixed, the crowd roaring, Dean believed he still had a future with his son. He believed there would be more calls, more laughs, more moments that fathers take for granted. He didn't know the Air Force had already lost contact with Dino's jet. He didn't know a search team was already combing the mountains. He didn't know the worst moment of his life was minutes away from colliding with him, right there under the stage lights. Because that innocent morning phone call would be the last time Dean Martin ever heard his son's voice. The night was electric. At 9 p.m., Dean Martin stepped into the spotlight like it was 1965 again. Tuxedo sharp, eyes sparkling beneath the haze of stage lights, the roar of 5,000 fans washing over him like a wave of nostalgia. From the first note, he had them. "That's amore, ain't that a kick in the head? Memories are made of this." It was more than a concert, it was a time machine. For 90 minutes, Dean made the audience believe that the golden age of Las Vegas wasn't gone. It was just waiting for him to bring it back. And then it happened. He was halfway through Everybody Loves Somebody, his signature hit, the very song that once knocked the Beatles off the top of the charts. The band played on, the audience swayed, and Dean's voice, weathered but powerful, drifted over the crowd like a lullaby. But from the wings, something broke the rhythm. Dean's longtime road manager, Eddie Marsh, appeared just off stage, frantically waving. At first, it seemed like a mistake, maybe a miscue, but his face was pale, ashen. Dean caught the movement. Mid-verse, he turned his head, saw Eddie, and froze. The music kept going for a moment longer. The band, confused, hesitated. Then, slowly, the notes unraveled, one by one. Dean stepped forward, staring at Eddie as if the world had gone silent. And then, in a voice that was suddenly hollow, he spoke into the microphone. "Something's wrong." No panic, no emotion, just a terrifying stillness. "Excuse me, folks," he said. He placed the microphone gently on the piano and walked off stage. The crowd applauded, thinking it was a break or some kind of bit. Maybe Dean was resetting the mood, throwing in one of those unscripted Rat Pack moments. But what was unfolding backstage wasn't an act. It was a nightmare. Eddie stood there, phone in hand, tears streaking down his face. Dean reached him, silent. Eddie couldn't speak. He just handed Dean the phone. On the other end, a voice that would change everything. "Mr. Martin, I'm calling about your son, Captain Dean Paul Martin." Dean's breath caught. His hand trembled. I'm sorry to inform you. The aircraft went down during a training exercise. There were no survivors. Dean didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stood there, still, silent, as if time itself had stopped. Then he dropped the phone. The man who had entertained millions, who had never cracked under fame, scandal, or heartbreak, now looked like a statue hollowed out by grief. He turned, almost mechanically, and walked toward his dressing room. Someone asked if they should cancel the show. Dean didn't look up. He just muttered 4 words that hit harder than any silence. My son is dead. And with that, the illusion of Dean Martin, the untouchable icon, shattered in front of everyone. Backstage, the air was heavy. The band had shifted into filler music, still trying to play along with what they thought was a staged exit. The audience murmured in confusion, waiting for Dean to return. But Dean Martin wasn't coming back. Not that night. Not ever in the same way. Inside his dressing room, he sat on a couch in his tuxedo, motionless. He wasn't weeping. He wasn't speaking. He just stared at his hands as if they no longer belonged to him. Eddie Marsh stood nearby, unsure whether to speak or just let the silence swallow them both. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Dean whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He called me this morning. He said he loved me. Eddie nodded, tears still rolling down his face. He did, Dean. He loved you so much. Dean looked up, but his eyes weren't focused. His voice distant, almost childlike. He loved flying, said it made him feel free. Then, without warning, Dean stood. I have to go home. I have to tell Jean. Jean Martin was his ex-wife, Dino's mother. Though their marriage had ended years before, their bond had never fully broken. They were connected by their children, and especially by Dino. The moment Dean heard the news, he knew he had to be the one to tell her. No one else could. A car was arranged. The drive from the bright lights of Las Vegas to Beverly Hills felt endless. Dean sat in the back seat, staring out the window, not saying a word. Eddie sat beside him, but there was nothing left to say. What could you possibly tell a man who'd just lost the person he loved most? When they pulled up to Jean's house, she was already standing at the door. Someone had called her. Her face was red, puffy from crying. She looked like someone who had aged a decade in an hour. Dean stepped out of the car slowly, his legs weak, his face hollow. And then he saw her. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He collapsed into her arms. And that's when Dean Martin, the legend, the icon, the untouchable man, finally broke. The sobs came hard, guttural, from a place so deep inside that no spotlight had ever touched it. He clung to Jean like a drowning man, and she held him, both of them consumed by a pain no parent should ever feel. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Reporters whispered outside their gates. But in that moment, there were no cameras, no fame, no Hollywood, just 2 broken parents, mourning a son who would never come home. By sunrise on March 22nd, the world knew. Dean Paul Martin, son of legendary entertainer Dean Martin, killed in plane crash. The headlines screamed it. The photos spread like wildfire. But for Dean, the news didn't hit in the form of a headline. It hit in the quiet, in the emptiness of a world where his son no longer existed. The media swarmed like vultures. Reporters camped outside the Martin and McDonald homes. Cameras flashed. Microphones shoved forward. Strangers asked how Dean was coping, as if grief could be packaged into sound bites. They wanted a statement. They wanted a face. But Dean had nothing to give them. He wasn't coping. He was drowning. Behind the scenes, the details of the crash only deepened the heartbreak. Dean Paul had been piloting an F-4 Phantom II fighter jet during a routine training mission over the San Bernardino Mountains. But the weather that day had turned against him. Thick clouds, poor visibility, and unpredictable wind currents. At approximately 4 p.m., his plane vanished from radar. Just disappeared. Search and rescue teams were deployed within the hour, but the terrain was brutal. Mountains, forests, dense rock formations. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the aircraft. Days passed. Every minute felt like a year. Dean held on to hope in the most fragile way, the kind of hope that lives in denial. Maybe it was a malfunction. Maybe Dino had survived and was waiting to be found. But by the 3rd day, all hope was gone. The wreckage was discovered deep in the mountains. The impact had been catastrophic, no chance of survival. Both Dean Paul and his weapons systems officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, had perished instantly. The plane had slammed into the side of a mountain with such force that there was barely anything recognizable left. And just like that, the most important person in Dean Martin's life was reduced to ashes in the cold wilderness. The military held a memorial service on March 26, 1987, at the Los Angeles National Cemetery. Full honors, flags folded, bugles playing taps through the still morning air. The crowd was massive: pilots, friends, family, Hollywood legends, fans. But all eyes were on Dean. He sat in the front row, wearing dark sunglasses that couldn't hide the way his body shook. When the honor guard handed him the folded American flag, the same one that had draped over his son's casket, Dean clutched it like a lifeline. And for the first time in public, he didn't try to be the cool one. He wept openly, shoulders trembling, face contorted in pain. Frank Sinatra gave the eulogy. His voice cracked as he spoke about Dino's bravery, his humility, his heart. But when he turned to Dean, looked him in the eyes, and said, "We all loved your boy, Dean, and we love you." There was no showbiz polish, no glitz, just raw emotion, shared among men who'd spent their lives pretending they didn't feel anything too deeply. Dean didn't respond. He didn't even move. He just stared straight ahead at the flag-covered coffin, as if blinking would make it more real. It was the kind of pain that left you suspended. No past, no future, just the unbearable weight of now. And when the funeral ended, Dean Martin, the icon who had made the world laugh, sing, and believe in romance, turned his back to the cameras and disappeared from public life. The man who had been everywhere was suddenly nowhere. After the funeral, Dean Martin didn't just retreat from the spotlight. He vanished. No press statement, no tearful interview, no public display of resilience. The man who had once been the face of charm, laughter, and indifference simply shut down. He canceled every performance on his schedule. Concerts, TV appearances, charity events, gone. The tuxedos stayed in the closet. The microphone gathered dust. His phone rang, but he never picked up. Friends tried to visit, tried to pull him out of it, but what they found was haunting. Dean Martin, the entertainer who had once lit up every room, was now just a shell. He spent his days sitting alone in the dark, watching old videos of Dino. Not their performances, not Hollywood footage, home movies. Dino as a child, playing tennis. Dino in his flight suit, laughing. Dino in grainy, silent clips, smiling into a camera that couldn't capture what he truly meant to his father. Again and again, Dean would rewind the tapes, stare at the screen like he could will his son back to life. He barely ate. He drank more. And not socially, the way people joked about Dean's habits, but desperately, quietly, alone. His home felt like a tomb. One friend, Shirley MacLaine, visited just weeks after the funeral. She later said, "The curtains were drawn. The lights were off. It was like grief had swallowed the air." She found Dean sitting in the shadows, a video of Dino playing on a loop. He looked up and said only one thing. "I can't do this anymore, Shirley. I can't live in a world where my son doesn't exist." His daughter, Deanna Martin, did everything she could to bring him back. She visited every day, brought food, tried to make him laugh, anything to keep him tethered to life. But nothing worked. As she later said, "My father's body was still here, but his soul was gone." The world still saw him as Dean Martin, the legend, the Rat Pack original. But inside, he had already left. His grief wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow erosion of a man who had no reason to keep pretending anymore. The spotlight, the fame, the glamour, it meant nothing without Dino. In 1988, he tried to come back. Just briefly. Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. convinced him to do a Rat Pack reunion tour, one last hurrah. The world was excited. The show sold out. But Dean didn't last. After just a few performances, he walked off the tour without a word. Later, when Frank asked him why, Dean's answer was brutally simple. "Every time I'm on stage, I think about Dino. I think about how he should be here. I can't pretend to be happy anymore." And Frank, who had known him longer than almost anyone, didn't argue. He just hugged his friend and said, "I love you, pal." For the next 7 years, Dean Martin lived in quiet exile. No stages, no spotlights, just old movies, old memories, and an unspoken countdown. The man who had once made the world believe that nothing could touch him had been shattered by one truth. No amount of fame, wealth, or charm could bring his son back. Dean Martin didn't die the day his son's jet crashed, but something inside him absolutely did. In the years that followed, the decline wasn't sudden. It was quiet, unfolding slowly, a slow-motion fade that only those closest to him could truly see. He stopped caring about the spotlight. The man who once embodied class and charisma began to shrink into himself. His once polished appearance gave way to baggy clothes, hollow eyes, and the frailty of a man who had lost the will to perform. He rarely stepped outside, and when he did, it was as if the world around him no longer mattered. The lights of Beverly Hills, the Hollywood parties, the adoring fans, none of it reached him. The grief began to eat away at his body just as much as it had consumed his spirit. Decades of smoking caught up with him. Emphysema took hold. His breathing worsened. He lost weight, lost strength, and eventually lost interest in trying to get better. Friends visited less often, not because they didn't care, but because Dean barely acknowledged them when they did. Most conversations were one-sided. A few words, a nod, maybe a sip of scotch. Then back to silence. Back to the home videos. Back to Dino. It was as if he had retreated to a different world. One where the only thing that mattered was the memory of his son. As his daughter Deanna would later say, he was still alive, but only technically. The real Dean had been gone for years. Then, on Christmas morning, December 25th, 1995, Dean Martin took his final breath. He died in his Beverly Hills home at the age of 78. The official cause was acute respiratory failure, but those who knew him best didn't need a medical report. Dean Martin died of a broken heart. The world mourned the passing of a Hollywood legend. News anchors paid tribute to his music, his films, his unmatched cool. But at his funeral, the eulogies weren't about the entertainer. They were about the man, the father. And when Deanna Martin stood at the podium and said, "My father never recovered from losing Dino." For 8 years, he carried that grief every single day. And now, finally, they're together again. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Dean Martin had once said, "I'd give up everything I have to have my son back. All of it, the fame, the money, the career. I'd trade it all for one more day with him." But he never got that day. And in the end, all he could do was wait for the moment when he wouldn't have to live without Dino anymore. Dean Martin was the face of effortless charm. He made life look easy, singing, joking, sipping a drink like he didn't have a care in the world. To the public, he was untouchable. Untouchable by critics, untouchable by time. But grief doesn't care about legacy. It doesn't care how many albums you sold, how many box office hits you had, or how many millions adored you. When it comes, it doesn't knock. It crashes through the door, and it leaves nothing behind. What happened to Dean Martin wasn't just tragedy, it was transformation. It stripped away the legend and exposed the man. A father, a man who loved deeply, and who shattered when the one person he couldn't live without was taken from him. Fame couldn't protect him. Money couldn't heal him. And time, the one thing people say helps, only deepened the hole where his son used to be. There's a haunting recording from that night, March 21st, 1987. You can hear Dean singing, "Everybody Loves Somebody," his voice steady, confident. Then you hear it stop. You hear the band trail off. You hear silence. And if you listen closely, if you really listen, you can hear the exact moment his life split in two. That moment doesn't just mark the end of a performance. It marks the end of a man's entire world. Dean Martin once said, "I'd give it all up for one more day with Dino." But grief doesn't make trades. It just takes. And that's the cruelest truth of all.